Hi, clinical problem solvers. It's great to see you all in tonight's session. Well, depending on what time zone you're calling from. I'm Vale. I'm a clinical problem solvers team member, and I'm very grateful to be joined today by Dr. José Eduardo Lima, who is a PGY2 of Neurology at Stanford University. So I'm just going to introduce him briefly. So he's a PGY2 neurology resident at Stanford University, as I said, and before residency, he worked in urban and rural emergency departments in Brazil since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed him to the healthcare disparities in his country. Prior to going to the front lines, he went to the prestigious University of Sao Paulo, Ribeirão Preto, for medical school, with a study abroad year at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And during medical school, he also went to the Mayo Clinic and the University of Michigan for electives in neurology. He now aspires to follow a career involving stroke, neurocritical care, and neurointerventional radiology in academia. When he's not carrying the stroke pager, José Eduardo Lima loves to bike, work out, prepare barbecues, and enjoy the outdoors with his family and his girlfriend. Yeah, we are very thankful to have you today with us, José.
Thanks so much, Vale. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, thank you, Rafa, for an invitation. I'm glad that this time we were able to make it happen. So it's going to be a pleasure to speak with you guys.
Before we go ahead with the questions, I would like for the rest of the team that is going to be asking them tonight, Marcela and Jasmine, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marcela. I am a doctor from Brazil. I'm currently applying for internal medicine for this match season, and I hope to do a fellowship in infectious disease.
Hello, everyone. I am Jasmine. I am a Mexican doctor and currently living in Texas. I'm preparing myself for the step 2, and anybody who needs any help, here I am. And yeah, we can start with the questions now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I just want to shout out Rafa for putting these sessions together. Thank you, Rafa, for making this possible. So the first question is a little nostalgic, I guess. What do you miss the most in Brazil?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think for different people, this question has different answers. But there's one thing in particular that to every IMG I had the pleasure to speak with, we all agree there is one thing that doesn't change, even if you're, training abroad for years or training abroad for just 1 or 2 years, is how much you miss your family and your friends back home. And people say that when you are living abroad, the grass is greener, things are better than when you're just living your regular life, if you will, back in your hometown. But there's one thing that missing your family and miss your friends, that doesn't change. And I'm a witness to this. I think since I moved for residency, I not only learned how to value my precious time with my family and my friends who are still in Brazil. So I learned to value those moments much more than I did in the past. And I think that was a big learning I had based on what I miss most about Brazil. Other things, of course, and Rafa, Marcela, you are probably agree with me. I think Brazilian food is second to none in the world. We have one of the best cuisines, and I do miss having some homemade food that's from Brazil or local food. I'm lucky to live in California, and I have to say the food here is pretty good. But still, there's nothing when you're just walking the streets of São Paulo, for example, and you can go to one of those tiny bars that they have like local food. And it's one of the interesting things I like to do when I'm back home. So that food is also something that I always think about. And from a more personal perspective, I'm from an area in Brazil, from the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, which is in the west. And there we have the biggest wetland in the world called Pantanal. And for some of you who are not familiar with Pantanal has one of the biggest diversity of birds in the world, as well as fantastic places to do fishing and enjoy the outdoors. And that's one of the nicest things that by living at home, I had just close to me, like just 3 or 4 hours away. And now it's much more farther, as you can tell.
Thank you so much for your answer. And yeah, I have to agree that Brazilian food it's something that we miss a lot when we are abroad. And kind of following up on that question, we love to know what are your favorite Brazilian food and your favorite place you visit when you're in Brazil.
Right. So as Vale already mentioned in the intro, I'm a barbecue lover. Since very early on, I learned to barbecue with my dad and my family. When I was still living back in my hometown, we would prepare a barbecue basically every Sunday. And it became a sort of thing that every weekend have the family around you and everybody's around the grill helping you to prepare meat. So there's this team effort to get the barbecue done every weekend. And some people are taking care of the meat, other people are taking care of the rice and all the other side dishes we usually serve in Brazil. And it's one of those unique moments that you become more connected with people and you learn that actually the art of barbecue in Brazil is not only about getting the food done, everybody eats and then you just leave. No. It's about staying around the grill and actually taking the time to talk to everyone. So it's one of those moments we actually have a lot of quality of time with those people that we love and we care about. So I think barbecue is not only food experience, but it's also a very important social and personal experience for those who appreciate that for years like myself. And another nice thing about barbecue is that it's a very, I think, diverse type of food that you can prepare because you can do everything from meats to vegetables. So even vegan people can have a great time with it. And as someone who has a girlfriend who's now vegetarian, I'm very aware about it, and I always make sure we have vegetarian options when I'm preparing barbecue. And I'm glad that here in California, the barbecues I had with some colleagues from residency, they were all in a similar way as we do in Brazil. So it's been nice to also bring a little bit of this culture to some of the folks here. And speaking of a place that I love to visit in Brazil, I cannot leave Florianopolis out of this list. Florianopolis is the capital of Santa Catarina State in the south. If for you guys who are watching us, if you like to Google it, or if you like to type in the chat so people can look for that, I strongly recommend everybody to read more about Florianopolis. I think it's a great place to visit. It's a beautiful city, and you have everything from urban tourism to nature and beautiful beaches there. I had the privilege to take my roommate, who was an orthopedic surgeon resident last year here at Stanford, to Florianopolis in my first vacation that I went back to Brazil. And he had such a wonderful time there by checking out all the outdoorsy activities, but also the Brazilian cuisine, as we mentioned already. So I would highly recommend Florianopolis to everybody, and I'm glad to take some people there for those who are interested.
Wow, that sounds really good. Now I'm hungry and want to visit Brazil. It will be amazing to share a barbecue with you and the Sleepy Solvers family. So for the next question, what were the reasons that made you go to the USA?
Jasmine, that's a great question. And that was probably one of the most frequent questions I got during the interview trail when I was interviewing for residency. I think there are a group of reasons about why you decide to leave your home country and train abroad. But if I was like thinking about the main ones to make that decision, I would say that one key driver for me was to look for more opportunities in research and academia. And it all harks back to the time when I was doing my study abroad year back in the Netherlands in 2015, 2016. And that experience was eye-opening to me because I realized that even though people are not living in Brazil and they are Brazilian, they have been able to do amazing things for the country. So we are very privileged nowadays to live in a generation, in a world in which, even though you're not physically located in a certain place, it doesn't mean that you do not have connections to that place. It doesn't mean that you cannot impact the healthcare in that place, right? And that was something that when I started medical school, I had very strong in my principles that I really want to give back to my country somehow. And of course, in addition to improve my patients' lives and making sure the field of neurology is moving forward. So when I realized that was also a possibility by training abroad, I decided to read more about where are the best opportunities for those who want to pursue an academic career in research, involving clinical trials, and being able to also spend time with teaching and having a good support from an institutional standpoint. And I think when I realized the United States was that place, that's when I really committed. I became 100% committed to the process. Another thing that was very important in this decision, and it's not an easy decision, to be honest with you guys. It takes time, and I think it is important to be very mature and take the time to think about how that can affect other areas in your life, right? So for those of you who are watching and think about applying to the residency in the US, talk to people, make sure you have enough information before you make decisions and you commit to the process. But once you have it and then you are sure what you want, it just works beautifully. But another thing that also contributes is that, as you know, the United States and Brazil, they have strong ties. The US right now has the largest number of Brazilians outside Brazil. That number is around 1.8 million people per recent data. So I think that's a testament to how Brazilians, they are well received in the US, and how we also share many cultural traits. And that, of course, makes it easier in terms of adaptation, in terms of getting, becoming a part of the system here. That was also another important reason. And finally, being around people who think in a similar manner to you, in the sense that people who want to get out of the comfort zone in a very deliberate manner, people who are committed to advancing the field of neurology and field of medicine. And I think that all nurtures your journey and motivates you to give your best every day. And I'm grateful to be among these people here in California. I think all of my co-residents and residents right now from my year, fellows, they are all following that path, and it is an honor and privilege to train with people such as them. So I think having good company when you're in your training is very important, and that's of course one very important reason why I want to move.
Thank you, José. So for the next question, tell us about a good moment that you remember when you moved to the US.
Oof, that's a tough one, Valley. But well, I would say I'll share you two bad moments. One of them is hilarious. One of the other one is more like sensitive. I would say missing your friends' weddings is something that's very hard. And I've missed 3 weddings already since I started residency. All 3 in Brazil. But I was happy to at least make to a few of them during my vacations. I was able to coordinate some time here and there. But missing your friends' weddings, and of course, all the family moments that you're missing back home, I think that's something that, again, it's something you remember very often during your journey here. Of course, after months and years in the US, you also start to build your local family of friends, your extended family as well. So that eventually makes you feel better about it. But if you're like someone who has strong ties to your friends from childhood and from high school, which is my case, of course, you get very often these conversations with them when you're texting or when you're chatting over Zoom. I do have some friends who are living abroad in other places as well in Europe, and we all have save some time to talk over Zoom and WhatsApp sometimes, so we are used to that. But being physically apart from people that you care a lot is always challenging. But here's another moment that happened to me right after I moved. As you all know, when you move to the US, there's a lot of bureaucracy in terms of getting your social security number. getting your driver's license, because unfortunately, the driver's license you have from your home country, depending on where you are in terms of state here in the US, it doesn't allow you to drive for a long time. And in California, that was a very short period. So eventually I had to apply for a formal driver's license here. And as someone who's driving since I was 18 years old, lived in Europe, drove in Germany, I love cars. I love watching Formula One. So driving wasn't a big issue for me, and never got a ticket in Brazil. That's something I'm really happy about. But then I would just want to expedite my process, basically. So I enrolled to the first behind the wheel exam that I just found here in the area. So there was a county close by that had a slot, say 2 weeks later from the date I was looking for. Said, okay, perfect. I'm just going to enroll it. I'm going to read about the test, and I'm going to do it, and it's going to be fine, right? And then I told my Brazilian friends who live here in the Bay Area, I said, hey, I just enrolled to this behind the wheel test. Do you guys have any, important tips? I said, oh, it's going to be fine. And then I took it, and that was the first test in my life that I failed. And it was funny because I was like, okay, I'm driving for more than 10 years, and how can that happen? And it was a nightmare because I needed to drive to go to the hospital. So for more than a month, I had to wait about a month until I was able to take it again. And I had to figure out my whole transportation. And that took me a lot of energy in a busy month, because I was on wards back then. So that was really tough for me. On top of the hilarious fact that, well, you drive for 10 years and then you a driver's license test, right? But after that, and I got back to my Brazilian friends, and then they were laughing at me, say, well, we didn't want to tell you, but everybody in this group who tried to take the driver's license exam in that county actually failed the test. So I found that funny, and that was nice of them of not telling me beforehand. But anyway, in the end, I retook the test, and everything went fine. But it's one of those things that you don't expect to happen, and then suddenly you just are spending a lot of energy. So when you're in these transitions between one country to the other, there are always things that sometimes you're not considering your radar. And I think it's very important to map those things as early as possible so you can get ready for that. So here's my pro tip: get ready for the bureaucracy. It's real.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And as an IMG, what were the most significant hardship that you had to overcome during residency so far?
I think that's a really good question. And Marcela, Rafael, as you also train in Brazil, and I don't know what's the situation in Peru, Mexico, or other countries, except for a few of them in Europe, but one thing that compared to our reality in Brazil and here in the US, that's very different is the burden of administration tasks in your workload as a physician. And I think for people who were able to rotate during medical school, you get a good sense about it. And I think that's one of the key reasons why it's very important to actually have clinical rotations in the US as a medical student. So you get more familiar with the system, and you get to know people, and also get to know how the system works in more detail. But as a resident, you are expected to do those texts more often during the day and in a larger volume, right? And making the shift from working in an emergency department in Brazil during the pandemic, which was very fast-paced. So you would see everything between 40 to 60 and sometimes 80 patients, 100 patients in a 12-hour shift. You don't have a lot of time to document, and the expectation of documentation is much more compact, if you will. And then when you come to the city here in the US, the amount of time that I actually spend with documentation, and also with some extra forms for insurance, for pre-authorization, I think for some people that in the beginning can be a shock. And that was one of those things that it took me a few months to get used to, because I was doing this shift from coming out from emergency department in the pandemic in a totally different pace of work and starting a residency here. And even though I had done clinical rotations before, again, switching back to the model here took me a while and took me a lot of energy as well. But after a few months in intern year, you get you get to learn all the details about the process, and you feel much more comfortable, become more efficient as well. But don't underestimate this when you're starting residency. I think if you're coming from a different system, be mindful that we do spend more time making documentation happen here, and I think that's important for patient care at some extent. I think it's a lengthy discussion about how we should document things, but I think in terms of transition of care, when you're preparing handoffs and signing out to other teams, we dedicate much more time and much more attention to that. And I think that's one of the things that I think can be positive about it.
Well, definitely thank you for this advice. I think that our next future interns will appreciate very much. So for the next question, what made you choose neurology?
All right, that's another classic question. I would say it sounds cliche, but I have always been amazed by the brain since early on med school. And it is very interesting how some personal experiences, they play a role into that. And I had several of them during medical school, shadowing neurologists, shadowing neurosurgeons as well, and getting to learn more about the day-by-day of the specialty and what is it like to be in the shoes of a neurologist, on the shoes of a neurosurgeon. But when I was younger, and again, Rafael and Marcela will know what I'm talking about. It is very often that from time to time we have some surges of dengue in Brazil. And one of those times I was 12 years old and I got dengue, and that was pretty bad. I was like very sick for about a week and eventually got over it and it was much better. But during that time, dengue more often than not makes you feel very nauseated. And I was taking Reglan or metoclopramide for people who are not familiar with brand names in the US. I was taking metoclopramide around the clock. And at some point, I developed an extrapyramidal reaction, and I had like a terrible dystonia in my right arm. And after that happened, went to the emergency department. What's going on? This guy has dengue. This guy has low platelets and doesn't move his right arm. So we start to think about other things, and that was the first time I had a face-to-face encounter with a neurologist in my life. And I remember in detail how that neurologist in particular treated me and walked me through his thought process about what was going on. And then eventually I was treated for that and I got completely better. And I was wondering, wow, that's interesting. Like I was barely moving my right arm, and now I'm back to baseline. And and it was just this a reaction to metoclopramide back then. Luckily, it wasn't anything that was more severe. So after that, of course, I'm not taking metoclopramide anymore. But I think it's nice to have this experience in which you have your skin in the game and you are on your patient's shoes in your specialty. I think even though when I think about starting medical school and still think about other specialties other than neurology, I always carry that experience with me. And I think at some point it made me kept an open attitude towards neurology during med school. And well, here I am. And lastly, as we mentioned at the beginning, I'm very interested in stroke, very interested in neurocritical care, all things about acute neurology. And I have a lot of exposure to stroke. Back in my med school in Brazil, we have a great stroke service. So med students, they get to see and get to do a lot there. And I think that definitely make me feel more comfortable with this environment of, fast decision making and making decisions that can change patients' life in just a fraction of minutes. And after that, that's when I start my journey pursuing a neurology residency, and more specifically focusing in acute neurology.
Thank you for sharing your story. I love it. As a person that loves neurology, I can definitely relate. So for the next question, we wanted to know, based on your experience so far, how different is neurology in Brazil and in the US? And I think you just started with some of that question, but if you could just elaborate a little bit more.
Oh, sorry about it. Can you repeat the question? I got a glitch here.
Oh, yes, of course. So it is based on your experience so far, how different is neurology in Brazil and in the US?
Good question. As someone who worked in rural areas in Brazil, I had the chance to see patients with neurological conditions that went undiagnosed for years. There was a particular story that I like to tell people. I was 1.5 hours away from my hometown in Mato Grosso do Sul, and to give some perspective, it's a state that geographically is as big as Germany, but it has a lot of farmlands there, and we have about 2 million people living in the state, and almost half of these people, they live in the capital where I'm from. So we can imagine that there isn't a lot of people, spread out the territory there. And 1.5 hours away from the capital means a lot in terms of resources, in terms of having access to specialists. And telemedicine by that time was something that was still being developed in Brazil. Even though we had the pandemic, that was being a strong push to perform telemedicine in several areas, especially for COVID patients who had mild symptoms. For specialty care in particular, that was something that was still being developed. And I think the situation is not very different right now. We do have more telemedicine services there, but things are still in a situation where patients need to learn about it and start using the resource. But long story short, it was a Friday night. I was in the emergency department. I was the only physician in the city. It was a 10,000 there were 10,000 people living in the city. And usually the night shifts there, you would get everything from 1 or 2 people to like someone who had a car accident, and then you need to transport them right away to the referral center. And there was this lady who came in endorsing some dysphagia that was getting worse in the last months. She also had some weakness that seemed to be more proximal initially on her arms. She was having a hard time to comb her hair. She was also having a hard time to climb up on stairs. And I noticed that she was having some involuntary movements in her muscles that seemed like fasciculations. And I was thinking about, well, someone who's weak and has fasciculations, that's not right. And her voice had a different tone as well. So I was thinking about, well, this could be myasthenia gravis. Nobody talked about with her. She didn't see her PCP back then as well to talk about it, because it was just hard to get an appointment. And when I was testing her reflexes, and I saw her muscles, she had atrophied muscles on her arms and had fasciculations, and she was hyperreflexive. And then I realized, okay, we have upper and lower motor neuroscience here, and I'm concerned about ALS to wrap up the discussion. And I was thinking about a way how could I make this connection between her and some neurologist somewhere, right? And I was lucky to have a friend of mine who is a great neurologist back in my hometown, and I called him immediately, said, "Hey, do you have an open slot in your agenda? In the next days, I have a patient that I think needs to be seen right away." And luckily, she had the financial condition to go to the capital by herself and get connected with a provider. Eventually, they confirmed the diagnosis, and she had ALS, and that was undiagnosed for about 2 or 3 years. So I think all over the world, people who lack access to specialty care, the time between having symptoms and actually getting the right diagnosis and get the right management for that, even that if that means comfort care or less invasive measures, if you will, is pretty long. And when we advocate for our patients who are in those areas, and I know a little bit about Marcela's experience with that as well. which is, I have to say, it's very, very, very nice for those of you who heard about it. I think we not only need to advocate for better access and making sure that patients can actually afford it, but also how can we immediately deal with things that are just happening in front of you, and sometimes you need to be creative when you have such situations. I was lucky to have someone that I knew I could reach out to and ask for, for an expedite visit in their clinic. But that's not how it happens every time. And I think technologies like telemedicine can definitely play a key role into closing the gap in places where you have these disparities in care. So I'm a strong believer in telemedicine for that regard, to make sure you are prioritizing people who need to be seen earlier. And I think Brazil has a long way to work in that, but I'm hopeful that with some of the people who are going to take over the healthcare management in the country, I hope that this is one of the things that should be addressed at some point.
Thank you so much, Dr. José, for this answer. And yeah, I think it's so important to raise the discussion, especially for our country and for healthcare access. And moving on, another question is, were there any perceived bias or prejudice experienced by you in your career as an IMG so far?
So that's another excellent question. I would say that I'm in a lucky position in which I'm in a program that values diversity, and it's great to have co-residents who were born in South Korea, for example, Greece, China, and know that we all share similar paths to some extent. And of course, we all come from different social backgrounds, different personal experiences and cultures, but I think being around people who at some point had to make the move from their country is something that really adds value to the cohort of residents and also to the care of patients. And because here in the Bay Area in particular, we have a huge Latino population, a huge Asian population, and many of them, they are underserved. They don't have access to regular healthcare. And I think that's not only makes it easier for you to connect with them, as many of them, they are going through this transition between going from one country to the other. So I think that definitely adds to patient care, pardon me, at some point. And moreover, we can also discuss about how important it is to have different perspectives for bringing different experiences in different healthcare systems to the table. And as someone who practiced in Brazil during the pandemic and spent some time in the Netherlands, who also has a very interesting medical system, I have to say, and now practicing in the US, I think it is really nice to make comparisons between these three places and see what are we getting right in every place of them and what every place can learn from each other. And I hope that in the future, I'm not only me, but also all of my IMG colleagues are able to contribute to it. But having said that, I'm in a place where I don't feel strong biases or prejudices regarding the fact that I am IMG, because I'm in a program that takes diversity seriously. And being in the Bay Area, where we have people from all over the world, really, people who are here for years, people who just arrived, I think that creates a very friendly and a very welcoming atmosphere. So lucky to be in California, lucky to be in my program, and I'm very grateful for that. And I would finish this question mentioning in this a few days ago, I had several friends who are from a particular program on the East Coast, and they were talking to me about an email they got from their program director, giving them Happy New Year. And I just found it fantastic how that happened. And basically, the program director was wishing everybody a Happy New Year, and they were talking about how important it is to have IMGs and how that adds to diversity, how that adds to perspectives in healthcare, how that helps us realize things that we can do differently and in a better manner here. And he asked all IMGs in the program to send their description of a Happy New Year in their own language. So that was basically a gigantic text with Happy New Year and different languages. And I just found that so amazing, because I think that definitely shows who actually walks the talk and who actually embraces diversity and values the fact that you were chosen to be in that program. So as a resident who's in neurology, and we all know neurology has a good number of IMGs, I would say roughly a third of residents in the US, based on recent data, are IMGs in neurology. Other fields like internal medicine and family medicine, pediatrics, they also have a large number of IMGs. So taking into perspective, IMGs are very important for the workforce of healthcare in the US. And I think programs who actively realize that and value that as a virtue, as something that really can add value to patient care and to the training experience of everybody who's in the program, AMGs, IMGs, everyone, I think is doing a great job. So it's good to see that there are these people around. And if you're an IMG applying this year, I just want to tell you that there are places who will value, there are places who will provide everything they can to ensure you have a successful career. So make sure you're looking for those places.
That was an amazing answer. And I wonder how amazing would be having a potluck with all those trainees and all those cultures and languages together. And for the next question, how IMGs can make their application stronger in order to apply to more competitive programs?
So Yasmin, I would say I got this question several times from people who are in med school and the IMGs and they want to apply to residency in the US. It's always hard to point out one single factor that changes the whole picture. And as you guys know, the match is a multifactorial process. And that's one of the nicest things about the process, to be honest. Depending on how residency selection works in other places. In Brazil, for example, there is a lot of weight in the grades you get in the entrance exam, and not a lot of weight in terms of experiences, in terms of publications. I think the evaluation here is much more holistic and allows you to shine through different ways. But if I would say one very important experience that can contribute to several items in your application is definitely having a clinical rotation in the United States when you are a medical student. And that's completely different after you graduate and then you go to do your observerships or research fellow, for example. I think as a medical student, you have the unique opportunity to take care of patients directly and to learn how to present a case in a way that's done in the American system. And I think also people are more open to teach you those skills. Residents, fellows, everybody, attendings, they're willing to help because you are the med student in the team. And so I strongly recommend for those who are still medical students consider to apply, to organize a routine and try to have clinical rotation. I think that's, if I would name one single factor, that would be the most important one. But again, the match is a multifactorial process, and grades play a role, letters of recommendation play a role, personal experiences, research, medical education. Well, it's a long discussion, but I will name one single important thing, definitely clinical rotations.
Thank you so much for your insight. So finally, we wanted to ask you, which final piece of advice would you give for IMGs to succeed in the USA based on your experience?
Two things. Three things, actually. First thing, remain humble. Because you are starting your journey in a place where you're still learning how things work. And it takes time for you to watch and learn and get the tiny nuances of the culture, right? And I think even though, as I mentioned earlier, there are many things in common between Brazilians and people in the US, I think when we move here, there are things in the day-by-day base of someone who lives in the United States who we don't realize when we're living abroad. And those things you just learn after experiencing at least 4 seasons, I like to say. So it takes a long time. So remain humble during that period when you are still learning more about the culture. That's going to be very helpful to have better interaction with your patients, with your colleagues, and with attendings as well. Second thing is be grateful. because there's always, I think from the program director perspective, and I think it's always nice to try to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are in a different position, making decisions about your career. From the program director perspective, I'm very empathetic, and I recognize that when they decide to recruit an IMG, there is a risk on some occasions, because you are recruiting someone who's from different system, and you want to make sure they're going to be, welcome in the program. They're going to adapt. They're going to have a good time, because residency is intense, regardless if you are from the US or somewhere else. It is intense. It requires a lot of energy. So I do see that when program directors select IMGs, there is some risk-benefit ratio in this process, and that can be a hard decision to make. So when you are selected for that, be grateful and do your best to represent your fellow IMGs, because that definitely can create a pipeline for another road for more people who want to come to your program or to programs in your same institution. And if you're doing a good job, that definitely creates a better impression for other IMGs as well. So that's one important thing. And the third thing that I would list is be patient, because things take time. And as part of a generation who is very fast-paced, not only in terms of texting, in terms of interacting via social media, we tend to be very fast-paced with our career milestones. We want to accomplish things in a short period of time, and guys, some things take time, and I think it's very important to say it out loud, because for example, you cannot have a baby in less than 9 months. Some things take time. So if you're expecting to, for example, be recognized for A, B, and C, and even though we're doing hard work, our daily basis is all about increasing the chances of making things happen. So when you put a lot of energy in the match process, and half of us going through that right now knows that, there are a lot of uncertainty in the process when you are in the season. When you send your application in ERAs, you're just like, okay, what's going to happen now? Who's going to read my application? Who's going to invite me for an interview? In the end of the day, we don't know. We do our best to increase our chances. And I think for several things in life, that's the same principle. And so be patient, because sometimes you put a lot of effort and things will work out differently from what you expected. And that's fine, right? And I think embracing uncertainty and understand that sometimes you need to be patient until things happen is key in this process as well, because it's a long-term process. You start doing your clinical rotations, you take step 1, step 2 CK, and then you go over the application process. And I've seen people build a lot of anxiety during that, but I strongly advise you to be patient, and things happen the right time.
I just want to follow up with, real quick José's answer. So when I applied, it took 3 or 4 weeks for me to receive an invitation. It was so it takes a lot of time. I feel like some specialties more than the others. So for all the IMGs applying in the future, don't worry. Invitations will come. Just have to trust in the process and do your best.
Yeah, and everything's going well, right, Rafa?
I hope so. We'll figure out in 2 months.
I'm sure they're great.
Thank you so much, José, for your wise words and sharing your experience with us. It's been really enlightening. I think we have some time for questions from the audience. If you have any question, please open your mic or put them in the chat. I think we answered some of the ones that they have put already. Okay, so Shelly here has a question. Shelly, if you can open your mic, that would be great. If not, I can read from the chat. It's okay. Okay, yes, of course, no problem. So the question is, how could we optimize the rotational experience in the US as medical students to get the most out of it, including strong letters of recommendation? What would be your advice, José?
Shelly, my advice would be to not only focus on the schedule, of your rotation. That's important too. Getting the patient experience, getting in touch with residents and attendings during the day when you're rounding, when you're doing the hard work for your patients. But also, whenever you have a chance, try to meet one-on-one with residents, with attendings who had a similar career path that you were seeking to pursue. Because those conversations, they add you a lot of words of wisdom to you immediately and further down the road in the process. For every rotation that I had in the US, I always made sure I was saving some time to meet potentially residents, Brazilian attendings who were in those places to learn more from their personal experience. Because that's when I think we can now realize blind spots that sometimes are present in our radar that we're not able to see by ourselves, but there's someone who sheds light on it, and then you can learn from that. So I've learned a ton by having short meetings with people during my clinical rotations and by hearing their words of wisdom as well. So I would definitely recommend that you try to do so in an actively manner. And it looks like she has a follow-up question, Vale.
Yes, I mean, I guess from my experience in rotation, it's a little specific to the specialty you're applying to and the program. But the question from Shelley is, if we have an opportunity to meet with the program directors, what should we focus the conversation on?
One interesting thing that I've heard when I was preparing for my interviews in the match is that in selection process is that when programs are interviewing you, it's not only about programs interviewing you are also interviewing the program, and you should remember that. So make sure you have some questions about things that you like to know about the program in terms of the culture in that institution, in terms of the training opportunities, and how the program can support you later on in terms of job seeking. I think is also interesting to know where, like, for example, where are people from this program practicing right now? Are they in academia? Are they in the community? And what type of career do you want? If you want to be in academia, you would try to go to a program that at least most of the graduates are going to academia, right? So having this data beforehand is very helpful for you to make your decisions about where to apply and how to make your rank list. So, and I think those are very appropriate, PD appropriate questions. Always remember that, again, you are also interviewing the program, so feel free to ask those questions, and program directors are super nice about being transparent about this.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good advice. José, thank you so much. To keep in mind that we are also choosing where we're going to spend at least 3 or 4 years of our life. So it's also our choice. And I think that's really important. So I don't see any other.
Maybe I can ask him a question. José, based on your experience when you did your ranking list, what do you think people should prioritize? Since there are so many people going through this process right now.
It's a very personal question, I think. Some people, for example, location is a very important factor because you don't want to be far from a significant other or family. And I've seen Brazilians actively seeking to match in Florida or in Georgia, for example, because you are closer to Brazil, you have direct flights to Brazil. Texas also is a big place for that. But I think in the end, it's very personal, but definitely consider geography, definitely consider the local culture and how open the area is to, people who are from other places. We know that in the Bay Area, as I mentioned, we have tons of people from all over the world living here, and other places they have less people, right? So I think it's always important to keep that in perspective. I also did a bunch of research about cost of living when I was deciding about the ranking list. There's some great resources online, and I highly encourage you guys to look into those numbers because it's very interesting how that can change your daily life. And I think not everybody realizes that, because depending on where you go, how much you need to afford to live, that changes a lot. And I think we need to be very mindful about this. Other thing also, which was one thing that I didn't realize when I was applying, to be honest, and I learned after I moved, it would not change my ranking list, but something that if it's very important for you, you might want to consider that time zone. As you all know, we are having this session later in the East Coast time because California has a very different time zone. So I still have meetings with friends from Brazil and colleagues in Europe, but it requires a little bit more energy to make sure we can coordinate all the different time zones. And it's just one funny thing that I realized after several months in training. And then I was talking to a friend who's been like between the Bay Area and Michigan because he works for in the research field, and he was telling me that every time in the Bay Area I have to spend a lot of energy into coordinating meetings, and then I realized, oh, that's true. So when you are ranking programs, get one time before you start to build your ranking list, just separate say 20-30 minutes and think of have a brainstorm about everything that you think can affect or would be important for you to consider when you are ranking those programs before you build your own Excel sheet. So geography, if there's an airport close by, if there's significant other or other people that should be taken account, time zone, potentially. So, and also, local culture, cuisine, yada, yada. Reputation as well is very important. So I think in the end of the day, it's a very personal decision. Then it's up to you to decide what you're going to use as a priority to list your programs.
Thank you, Jose. I see another question in the chat. I think it would be good to end probably the session. What do you think were the biggest strengths of your application for the US residency?
So I think on top of the clinical rotations that I had the honor privilege to have here in the US, in which I had a wonderful experience, either both in Mayo and Michigan. I would say having this hands-on experience during the COVID pandemic is something that I actually, in the beginning, I didn't think was going to be interesting for programs, and in the end, as part of the whole history, and that was on top of the research projects I've done during medical school and some of the extracurricular activities. I was involved with voluntary projects during medical school involving the elderly, so had a lot of overlap with neurology, and I coordinated that project in particular. So that was one very important part of my application, I would say. And I think going back to the time I worked in the COVID pandemic, that actually was very well seen by programs, with the caveat that I was still a fresh grad. So when I applied, I was still a fresh grad. I had worked for less than a year in emergency departments in Brazil. So I think that's the caveat here. But that experience was surprisingly well seen, and it was something that I was just like, okay, it's going to be just another thing in the curriculum, and I think people will like it but not become very enthusiastic. And it was the other way around. I think maybe because everybody was more sensitive to the whole pandemic situation. My class was the first one who had virtual interviews, so there was a lot of uncertainty in that process. So I think when we were crossing paths with people who were actively engaged in taking care of patients who had COVID-19 or who were actively working in initiatives to tackle the pandemic, I think that created a lot of bonds with people. And it was really nice to hear nice feedback from people who were interviewing me about this experience and how that was important for my country to actually be there and serve the community during that hard time. And that came at a cost, Rafaela, because my original plan before COVID and everything happened was to actually come to the US for a research fellowship. And that was well organized by that time, but the pandemic started right before I was about to start the visa applications. And then everything was halted because they were only prioritizing people who were going to work with COVID-19 research directly. I had several friends in the year of 2020 who had the research fellowships granted and were not able to go to those positions. So we all have to switch our priorities at that time. And I think the most obvious move was, okay, I'm gonna serve my community and do my job as a physician. And I think that was, in the end, the best thing that could have happened, because I learned so much by working as a physician during the pandemic and as an emergency department physician. And for all of you who are watching us and are not familiar with the Brazilian healthcare system, we, in our country, when we graduate, we are allowed to practice medicine independently in some settings. And half, for example, is now working with primary care in Brazil. I think Marcel should be working as well, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so it's very common when you graduate from med school and you either want to apply to residency later on, or you want to work for the army for a year, or you want to work in the community for a certain period of time. That's very common to happen. So that's the path I took back then, and I'm very grateful that I grew a lot as not only as a person because of the hardships I had to face, but as a professional, as a physician as well.
Thank you so much, José, for your time tonight. Thank you for joining us in this session. It was very, very enriching for us. And I hope we can chat maybe a little bit more in the future as well. So, well, on behalf of the whole team, thank you everyone for joining. This session will be uploaded for people that maybe couldn't join today, but I'm sure they're gonna be eager to listen later. So thank you all, and see you tomorrow for Student VMR.
All right, thanks so much again. It was great. Talk to you all.
Bye, thank you.